Alright, today is the update day. We've finally received passive effects for all of the new Legendary and Masterwork weapons, as well as a brand new special attack for the Ek-ZekKil. So today I'm going to test them out and share my thoughts on where things now stand in the combat meta. I do have timestamps in the description if you're only interested in one of the weapons, but let's kick things off with perhaps the most interesting weapon of the update, the Ek-ZekKil. I was actually very close to making this its own separate video because this is the weapon that has had the most dramatic and the most impactful changes compared to the others featured in this update. Unfortunately, the Ek-ZekKil is an abomination and a complete disappointment. We were promised the bonk sword, and I don't know if you could even classify what we got as a fly swatter. This update has somehow made the Ek-ZekKil worse than it was pre-update. Now, fortunately, this has already been identified as being a problem, so the combat mods at Jagex are aware, and they're currently taking in feedback to give the Ek-ZekKil some proper juice as early as next week. So instead of making an inappropriately angry Reddit rant in video format, let's go over what the new EZK changes were, and I'll share my feedback where I think it can be improved. Let's start off by looking at the passive effect. The passive effect is called Ashen Vow, and it empowers 3 of your melee abilities. The first ability we're going to look at is Pulverize, which has had its adrenaline cost reduced from 100% adrenaline down to 60%. So now it's in line with something like an Overpower with the Zuck cape, and it actually becomes worth using. It's going to deal a similar amount of damage to Overpower, a little bit less, but it does come with its own bonus. For 30 seconds after using Pulverize, your target is going to deal 25% less damage to you. There is a secondary effect of Pulverize where if you kill the target by using Pulverize, you will get a big adrenaline refund. However, I think this is more situational and the damage reduction effect is going to be more relevant to more players. So that's obviously extremely powerful at any dangerous encounter that you might be using melee at. Think about places like the Archglacier's Flurry attack doing 25% less damage, or High Enrage Telos, or maybe even something as simple as fully AFKing Vindicta or any of the God Wars 2 bosses. This is a really powerful change and something I'm a big fan of seeing. Next up is the Quake ability. This ability doesn't do huge damage, and generally it's never really been worth using outside of area of effect scenarios or AoE Slayer scenarios. Quake has always had a side benefit of applying 2 stacks of affinity to the target, thereby increasing the player's hit chance. You may also be familiar with other weapons that apply affinity stacks, like the Gothic Staff special attack or the Statius Warhammer special attack, applying 2 and 5 stacks of affinity respectively. These special attacks have historically seen the most use at bosses with high defense and armor values in order for you to get 100% accuracy and full damage potential against them. So the EZK passive now makes Quake apply 4 affinity stacks instead of 2. That's almost as much as the Statius Warhammer, but for half of the adrenaline. So that's a really interesting change, but I still think it's pretty niche. When it comes to bosses that require the player to use accuracy buffs, the first 2 that come to my mind are Virago and AOD, where having affinity applied is going to benefit the whole team. If you're meleeing at Virago, it's generally always better to use a Dragon Scimitar special attack on a dummy during the previous phase in order to conserve more adrenaline and be able to dump damage faster on the upcoming phase. So for lack of a better way of describing it, as a meleeer at Virago, you're going to play more selfishly, only applying a personal accuracy buff, that way you can deal the most damage. So neither Statius Warhammer or this enhanced version of Quake are going to be super relevant at Virago. At Angel of Death, with almost any team composition, you will have someone designated to using the Statius Warhammer spec at the start of the fight. So there may be some very small niche argument to argue that the EZK passive is going to become the new go-to at a place like AOD, since it costs less adrenaline than a hammer, and it applies almost as much affinity. I would say that the majority of times the player who's using a hammer is going to be a necromancer who can simply equip the hammer in their main hand and not lose out on any of their conjures at the start. They wouldn't be able to do that with an EZK since it is a 2-handed sword, so a necromancer hammer is not going to benefit from this change. However, there are some times when either a major or a ranger can be designated to use the hammer at the start, and in those very niche cases, I think there might be a benefit from using EZK for reduced adrenaline cost. cost. I know this is really niche, but it's about the only use I could think of for 4 Affinity Quake, at least currently. There's always infinite possibility that future updates will make this passive effect more desirable. So the too long didn't read on this one. I think it's a very interesting change for Quake. A little bit niche for now, but I am a fan of this. Lastly, the Ek-ZekKil buffs the smash ability, and there's nothing fancy here, it just does more damage. I did also think it's a little bit funny that they mentioned the Ek-ZekKil is also going to buff the lesser smash ability, just in case you have some kind of weird account with 95 strength but under level 20 attack. So overall, I'm a big fan of the new passive effects on the Ek-ZekKil. Very cool. Now let's get into the more controversial side of the Ek-ZekKil, the special attack called Igneous Showdown. Again, I'll remind you that this is going to get updated potentially as early as next week, but let's talk about it as it launched today. Igneous Showdown replaced the previous special attack that, in layman's terms, was a big bleed, and it would escalate in power with subsequent bleeds. It was a very strong special attack, albeit it required being put in an EOF and being cast with a Masterwork Spear, but a very strong special attack nonetheless. The new special attack introduced today is called Igneous Showdown. It costs 65% adrenaline, and once you cast it, you'll do an average total damage of 250% ability damage, and the target will then become what's known as your flame-bound rival. A target that is your flame-bound rival is going to deal 5% reduced damage against you, and you will deal 5% extra damage against it. So as a concept, this would be your first ability that you use in the fight, before then building back to full adrenaline and using Berserk. You would then do bonus damage throughout the duration of the fight, so in theory, it would be a strong ability for really long boss fights like High Enrage Archglacior, Zamorak, or if you somehow wanted to solo all 7 million HP of Seryu's face. Conceptually, I think this is a really interesting special attack. It's very unique, but in practice, it just doesn't bring the juice that we wanted to see from the Bonk Sword. First of all, 65% adrenaline is insanely expensive, and the damage you get in return does not justify it at all. 250% initial damage is just not even close to enough, even taking into consideration the extra 5% of damage you'll be doing throughout the rest of the fight. There's almost no boss in the game right now that has enough hit points for you to even take full advantage of that. You would be far better off just using a Dragon Claw spec instead. More damage, less adrenaline. It's as simple as that. You can recast the Igneous Showdown special attack, and it would do more damage the second time, up to about 440% ability damage. But again, that 65% adrenaline cost is just insane, and you would be getting the same damage as an Armadyl Godsword special attack, which again costs less adrenaline, so you can see where it's a little bit ridiculous. So overall, the special attack is a big flop as it stands currently. I think for this to be viable, they would need to reduce the adrenaline cost drastically, down to say 35% adrenaline. I think you would also need to increase the initial damage. I would say putting it up to that 440% mark that you would be getting from the second cast would be more appropriate for the first initial cast. And to incentivize recasting this special attack throughout the fight, I think you would want to make that secondary recast a truly powerful bonk. Say for example, 500% ability damage but with a lengthy cooldown. The 5% buff and reduction to damage dealt and received is a cool gimmick. I would be curious if Jagex played around the idea of making that a team-wide buff rather than just an individual buff. That would undoubtedly incentivize someone on a large team, say at AOD or a Mascot, to be a full-time meleeer, and to further incentivize them actually being a meleeer rather than using yet another off-style switch, have that team-wide buff effect only be active while the caster is wielding the Ek-ZekKil itself. Admittedly, I'm completely clueless on how complicated or not that would be to implement for a developer, and I also don't really have a true sense on how potentially overpowered that could be in a team scenario. But having a huge incentive like that 5% extra damage for a whole team just by bringing a dedicated melee player during team bosses sounds pretty cool to me. So let me know what you think about that. But anyway, to recap my thoughts on the Ek-ZekKil. The Ek-ZekKil passive, easy 10 out of 10. The Ek-ZekKil special attack, I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 10. It's a really cool concept, it's just not enough juice. It is being looked at and it is subject to change, so fret not and settle down with all of this ridiculous panic selling stuff. Merchers are having a field day feasting on you. Next up, let's talk about the Fractured Staff of Armadyl and the Tectonic Armor passives. These are really straightforward, and they're just a straight up power increase. Elite Tectonic has received a plus 2% critical strike chance effect per piece worn, so that's 6% extra critical strike chance for wearing the full set of Elite Tectonic. That's going to be the same as wearing the Sliske/Tuska armor previously. Now it just comes with the added defense and the added power bonus of Elite Tectonic. As for the Fractured Staff of Armadyl, when you're actually wielding the staff, all of your critical hits will do 15 to 30% increased damage. This isn't an increased chance to crit like with the armor, but for every critical strike that you do actually land, it will be doing more damage. So to put the mage meta into simplest terms, you'll actually want to wear Tectonic armor now instead of Sliske armor. You'll want to have the staff equipped during all of your sunshines and while you're under the FSoA spec. And lastly, you'll want to have your magic dual wields equipped whenever Sunshine or FSoA are not available or they're on cooldown. So there's really nothing too much to test or showcase with these magic changes. This is pretty much just a straightforward jump in power. Lastly, let's look at the trio of Masterwork weapons and their new passive effect called Masterwork Mending. Each one of these weapons will now heal you for 2% of the damage that you deal. From my testing, this did feel a little bit weak. I didn't notice myself healing so much more that I could get away without food at bosses or that I could completely AFK some difficult Slayer creatures. I would have also liked to see some more visual feedback on how much I was actually healing thanks to the Masterwork weapons. If I was seeing some more of the purple hit splats like you see with Excalibur or while you're actually eating food, I think that would have gone a long way to give the illusion to the player or the sensation to the player that the Masterwork Mending was doing more work and it was a bigger buff than it actually is in practice. So unfortunately, I was a little bit underwhelmed with this passive overall. The one use that I was most excited to try was using the Masterwork Bow while being under the effects of the Eldritch Crossbow EOF, which turns off any split soul healing that you get in exchange for more damage. I was hopeful that the extra healing was going to be a way for players to slowly introduce themselves to practicing ECB rotations and getting more comfortable with foregoing soul split healing. But again, 2% just wasn't that noticeable to me. And there's nothing to complain about with this passive either, as it is just a flat out buff after all. It's not like we lost anything in exchange for this, unlike with the Ek-ZekKil, but it's not so powerful that new metas are going to revolve strictly around owning these weapons and using their healing effect. It's also not so powerful that I would recommend anyone to rush out and buy one of these weapons. I think that they keep their place as a great budget weapon that provides the best tier 100 stats, and it serves as an introductory high-level weapon for aspiring PVMers or avid slayers. So there you have it. That's everything I have to say after testing out all of the new Masterwork and Legendary weapon passives that were added in game today. I hope that it was informative and interesting. Leave me a comment if you're going to get any of these new weapons and what you thought about the update today. Consider sharing this video with a friend and subscribing to my channel for all kinds of content related to RS3. Thanks for watching and see you next time.